going to be addressing 4 questions. The first is, when there's violence between a couple, members of a couple, how often are both partners violent? That's in general. What about when there's severe violence and injury at that clinical level, if you will, of violence? How often is it mutual? Third, my numbering's off here, is the prevalence of mutual violence because of self-defense by women? Because that could explain it all. And third, what are the implications? Fourth, what are the implications for prevention and treatment? So, to the first question, when there's violence, how often are both? Well, the statistics are completely contradictory. If you take police statistics and US National Crime Victimization Survey data, then it's 80 to over 90%. Some police statistics, 99%, at least in the past. Since the pro-arrest policy in the United States, that's changed, but it's still overwhelmingly men. Shelters for battered women statistics are 100% male perpetrators, because in the United States, it's virtually forbidden to ask women about whether they have assaulted their partner. You just don't get permission to do the research. Having tried 3 times. Until 1975, those were the only data available. Then in 1975, my colleagues and I did a national survey, a nationally representative sample of American households, and we found, to our surprise, about the same percent of women, of men and women assaulted. Since then, there's been about 200 other studies that have found a similar gender symmetry in perpetration. And it's the best kept secret because it's not in textbooks on family violence. It just isn't there. And it's not in training manuals for police, for shelter staff, for batterer treatment programs. It's simply not there. And therefore, prevention and treatment has been based on erroneous data for the past 35 years. This will just give you a picture of the growth in studies. Here was our 1975 study. By 1985, by 1986, there were 23 studies, including 2 national surveys, and now there's more than 200 showing similar rates of assault by men, by male and female partners. Big difference, though, is the injury rate is not the same. Women suffer far more injuries from assaults than do men. A slap is not a slap. It depends on who's doing the slapping. And here's just 5 of the 17 or more studies showing mutual violence. These are studies by all different people and organizations. If you look down the both violent column, our 1975 study, 48% both violent. The National Comorbidity Study in the United States, 54%. National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, 50%. My International Dating Violence Study in 32 nations, 55%. The current International Parenting Study that my colleagues and I are doing, 60%. And if you notice that the half that isn't mutual, it's either divided about equally between men and women, male only or female only, or in the case of young couples, women only is more frequent than male only. Okay, that's in general. Most of this violence, 2/3 of it at least, is slapping, shoving, throwing things at the partner. What about when there's severe violence and injury, kicking, punching, choking, attacks with objects and weapons, and injuring a partner? How often is that mutual? Well, the method I used to get the data I'm talking about is to search for all the studies we could find that reported data on severe violence and reported it for both men and women. By reported it for both men and women, I meant if it's 0 for women, that's reported it. That's a very important figure. So whatever it is, from 0 to whatever rate it is. But the same data were gathered from both men and women, and it's on, and it included data on severe assaults or injury. So we found 62 studies that had data on both male and female partners, and then I cross-tabulated, did tabulations, crosstabs, correlations, the usual sort of thing. Here's an example. Well, the first step was to put it all in big charts like this. This is one of many pages of the table summarizing. If you take this first study, National Comorbidity Study, a major US mental health study, and it's a good study because it reports the data separately for women participants in the study and male participants. And the percent that the female rate is of the male rate is, if according to the men, it's half. According to the women, it's about the same. It's 100%, close to 100%. So it's entering that from this table into the computer and tabulating it. What do I find? Well, for the 39 studies of general population samples that had data on severe violence, the percent who severely assaulted a partner, percent of men who severely assaulted a partner was 5.1%, percent of women 7.1%. Again, I have to point out that this is not injury. This is perpetration, not victimization data. The same level of attack by a man has a higher probability of producing an injury. Then, and what does that mean? Well, severe assaults by women were 42% greater than by men. Or, putting it still another way, almost half again more women than men in these general population surveys severely attacked a partner. And if you take punching, choking, and attacks with objects and weapons as serious enough to warrant some type of intervention, it means that substantially more women than men engaged in clinical level violence against a partner. This just shows, and I'm going to skip over this, that the more men in a study, each dot represents a study. There's 39 dots, 39 studies. The higher the rate of assault by men in a study, the higher the rate of assault by women. Now, what about injury? There's only 14 studies that I've located so far because most studies of partner violence in the general population don't provide data on injury. But when they do, the average percent who injured a partner across these 14 studies is 8% of men, 6.5% of women. So men produce more injury. Most studies, the difference is greater than this is shown. I'm not sure why it's only a small difference here. But taking that, that's the evidence of these studies. The rate for women injuring a partner was 87% of the male rate. That's close to this being the same as the male rate. But we don't have much data on severity of injury. It can be range, so that is additional data needed. The correlation between male and female rates of injury is just about perfect. Studies that find high rates of injury by men find high rates of injury inflicted by women. What about agency samples? Couples, relationships involved with an agency of either social support, such as a shelter for women, or an agency of social control, such as a court. The average percent who assaulted or injured a partner across these 20 studies is 56% of the men and 44% of the women. So the average percent of violence by women is almost the same as the percent by men among those studies which obtained the data. Usually they don't. And what's the general conclusion from the 62 studies? That mutual violence predominates. Moreover, the more severe the violence, the more likely that both are assaulting, which is the opposite of what most people think. They think that when it's a really bad case, must be male only. But the opposite is found. The more severe the assault, the greater the probability, and the more injury, the greater the probability that they're both doing it. And my interpretation of this is that it's because it reflects an underlying inability to deal in a rational basis with the partner by both, a propensity to violence, to get things adjusted in a way that they need to be done. So that's my interpretation. The predominant interpretation, when this is even recognized, which it's not usually even recognized, I tell you, it's not in textbooks, it's not in manuals, it's there, 200 studies, but when it is discussed, the almost invariable assertion is it's in self-defense. That's why it's mutual. He hits and she's defending herself. Well, what does the research show? Well, if you go back to the very first of the slides I showed you, there's as many female-only, is the only one violent, as male-only violent across study after study where that data has been gathered. So, and for young women, not for women up to the mid-20s, it's female-only occurs more frequently than male. It evens out in the late 20s and stays about even from then until the 70s. And then there's also studies of who hits first, the initiation of violence. I've looked in detail at 7 studies, and the range is from 40% to 73% of women hitting first. In other words, in about half the cases, if you take the midpoint between there, in about half the cases, she's the first one to hit, and the other, he's the first one to hit. Well, getting directly to self-defense, here's results from 6 studies. There's more. There's probably 15 or so, but here's 6 that I have time to present this morning. 5 found only a small percentage in self-defense, such as 5%, 10%, 15% of female violence. And those studies, when they asked both the male partner and the female, found about the same rate of self-defense by men. Men act in self-defense too. But it's not the predominant cause of women's violence or men's violence. If it's not self-defense, why do women do it? Why do men do it? Women do it for the same reasons as men. Here's what the studies show. Coercion. He's doing something that he shouldn't do. He's not doing something he should do or she should do. So it's a response to frustration at misbehavior by the partner as perceived by the offender, anger at the partner, and punishing the partner for their misbehavior. That's especially true in the case of sexual infidelity, where it's a predominant cause by both men and women. To take example of just one study by Hetrich and O'Leary, this study asked a sample of women university students to list of those who had hit a partner, to list the main cause of the last time they hit a partner. And here's the 5 most frequently listed. Anger at him. He lied. Poor communication. I'm not sure just what that means. This is what the women wrote down. Lost my temper. He embarrassed me. I was jealous. So, whoops, same slide, better format. So now we get to question 4. What are the implications for prevention and treatment? The general implication, under which my more specific ones are subsumed, is that we need to recognize and base interventions on the prevalence of female as well as male partner violence. At present, the interventions are based on the erroneous assumption that this is a male behavior, and women seldom do it. So this requires a reversal. And then more specifically, if you look at it from a primary prevention program, no hitting educational programs must be explicitly directed to girls and women as well as boys and men, but that's not the case. Just last year, the British government announced that every school pupil in England is going to be taught that domestic violence against women is unacceptable. Now, I'm certainly in favor of that, as all of you are, but we have to have it domestic violence, partner violence against anyone is unacceptable. And being gender neutral and saying hitting a partner is unacceptable, domestic violence is unacceptable, that isn't enough, because one of the great benefits that we owe to the women's movement is that they've made this an issue that everyone recognizes, partner violence. It's been there all along, but it wasn't until the women's movement brought it to the forefront and led many, many societies to do something about it. But the flip side of that is, as it should be, the women's movement is concerned with the protection and well-being and release from oppression of women. And people, it's been such a successful campaign that people, when you talk about domestic violence, the image comes to mind is men hitting women. So gender neutral is not sufficient. It's perceived as referring to men. We have to tell women and girls that it's morally wrong, a criminal act, and a danger to women, because it increases the probability of her partner being violent. Well, what about programs for parents? Parents need to stop teaching children violence by the meta message that comes from when they're teaching them other things, when they use spanking and smacking children to correct misbehavior. That's what you've just seen a minute ago partners do. They're correcting misbehavior. Overwhelmingly. There are sadistic people out there, but I'm talking about what's typical in the population. They're correcting misbehavior. Where did they learn that a way to correct misbehavior when someone persists in it and when it's really outrageous misbehavior? They learned it at home from their mothers and fathers. So, and there's lots of evidence for this. I don't have time to present the evidence, but there are good studies, longitudinal studies, as well as cross-sectional. So we need to stop teaching violence by spanking and snapping. Over 90% of US parents to this day hit toddlers. Less than it used to be a generation or two ago, but they're still doing it. And the lesson of spanking tends to be applied, as I said, later in life. Well, treatment of offenders. The first thing is to determine who is hitting. We need to replace the default assumption of only one perpetrator, who's almost always assumed to be a man, with assuming that it could be male only, it could be female only, or it could be mutual. And once safety has been assured, the first step is to establish who is doing the hitting and to what extent it's bidirectional. Only then can treatment proceed on the basis of the actual pattern of the relationship. And second, as far as etiology and treatment modalities and treatment planning goes, there needs to be diagnosis for multiple causes. Replace the assumption that the primary cause is male dominance with the assumption that male dominance is important, but it's only one of many causes. I can give you case after case of equalitarian men who hit their partners. This false single cause approach handicaps treatment. And in fact, in the United States, as you'll hear in more detail from Professor Stith, the rules in many states forbid treatment of other causes, such as inadequate anger management skills, and forbid couple therapy when it's a court-mandated treatment. So, more generally, in the treatment, we have to address coercive control by women as well as men. Almost all studies that have tested both men and women using the same instrument have found that women engage in coercive control as much as men. And women as well as men need to learn non-coercive ways of attaining their goals and correcting misbehavior on the part of the partner. Well, the safety of women requires ending that harmless minor violence by women. It's only viewed as harmless because it's produced not only one of the main reasons, it produces less injury, which is very important. But the studies show that this harmless violence increases the risk of the woman being assaulted. It harms children who witness it. It harms the relationship. It's immoral. It's a crime. Having said that, I want to close with an agreement that when it comes to services for victims, because women are victimized more severely, physically, economically, psychologically, on average, victimized more severely, and have less resources to cope with it, services for women should have priority, regardless of who initiated the violence and regardless of whether it's mutual. But although that should have continue to have the priority, in addition, there needs to be a recognition that there are also male victims who need and deserve help. Thank you.